Hi guys, welcome to a very special guest episode of Milo's Book Club as we explore the Odyssey. This is a new foray for me, and we have a very special guest lined up today, none other than Erica Stevenson from Moan Inc., who is our resident classicist for the day, author, also expert in more than just the Odyssey, but in the context of what we're going to be talking about today, all things Odyssey.
All things introduction to the Odyssey, yeah?
Yes. And I've brought Erica in here because I thought she would be the perfect person to act as a guide, essentially, as we embark on this journey. There's an easy joke to make there that I won't make.
I know exactly what you were going to do there.
I'm resisting. I think as new people to this text, certainly speaking for myself, there's a lot of things that you read going through the even opening pages of the Odyssey, and you immediately go, oh, this is a bit weird, or hold on, why is this formulated this way? Or why am I being told all these character names? Do I even need to remember these names? There's so many things like that. And so the purpose of this episode of this journey is to try to check off some of those need-to-know items. And we're going to formulate it kind of like the Odyssey Book Club Iceberg, kind of, where we'll start with the obvious things. Who's Homer? Or who were Homer?
A big question.
The big question. And then we'll move through the time period and some of the themes that we can expect to see from what we learn about customs and the historic, real, truthful element of things, through to some exploration of theme that is a little bit more in narrative, but maybe a little bit more detached from the reality of the time. So we've got a lot to talk about today.
Yes, a lot. We're going to kind of lay the foundation for you guys to hopefully make it a little bit easier, make it a little bit more palatable. It's still a really good story. You can go in blind, but I think knowing a bunch of these things will just kind of help do that a little bit.
Interrupting here real quick though. Hi guys, Milo speaking. If you want to participate in the book club itself, you need to subscribe to my second channel, Milo 2, which is where I'm posting my breakdowns of each of the books of the Odyssey with my Mimor Ruthan and a bunch of other book club content as well. So make sure you subscribe there on YouTube, or you can find me obviously on other podcast platforms. But otherwise, if you're happy where you are, just enjoy this episode with Erica talking about our Odyssey Iceberg.
Erica, to toot her horn, has so much experience talking to people on the Moan Inc. YouTube channel about classics and essentially doing exactly what we're going to be doing today, which is guiding people through that journey when they may not be experts or anything even close, but they still have some interest in the topic and they're still giving it a shot. So I'm very curious to hear how that experience that you have will inform some of these things that we're going to rattle through today. So I'll give you your first question, shall I?
Okay, let's go.
We'll jump straight into it in our iceberg. Who's Homer, and what's going on with the question of whether there's a Homer or multiple Homers or that sort of thing?
So Homer, first and foremost, is our author of the Odyssey, also the author of the Iliad. So if you see both of those books, same person, one name, very, very iconic. It seems like everybody knows the name Homer, which is quite interesting because we know very little about Homer. So when it comes to who Homer was, it really is this giant question in academia in particular. It's actually called the Homeric Question. So you capitalize the H and you capitalize the Q, and then sometimes you can just see it referred to as the question with a capital Q. So the problem is that in the ancient world, they didn't think it was important to talk about their authors. So we hear nothing from any time period about who Homer was because they're not really all that interested in that side of things. They're not interested in authorship. So when we look at Homer, we kind of take for granted, I think a lot in the modern world, when we go into a bookshop and you see, like when you see my name, Erica Stevenson, you're going to assume that's a woman. But like I always use the example of like my brother's called Dylan, that's a gender neutral name. You might not be able to infer that much, but still. Homer is just a massive, like there's just no idea of what goes on there. So we have historically thought that Homer was a man simply because why not? It seems like the most common response. It seems in the ancient world they used he, but when we're looking at the ancient world that describes who Homer was, that's like the 5th century BC. Okay, we're not going to do a lot of dates. I promise. But that is from the 5th century BCE, and Homer's from the 8th century BC, so you can't really take that as 100%.
Sure.
And when it comes to scholarship, we are more so leaning towards now the idea that there were multiple authors that helped write this story. It's just so expansive and so large. There are so many different parts of it and different mechanisms. It seems more likely that Homer was a collection of what we call bards, and they then told the story to each other. They decided on the best parts, and then that's... Homer's almost like Monty Python as a name, right? So Monty Python, one name for a collection of 6 comedians, same sort of idea as what we kind of think now.
And the form of the storytelling was oral poetry, which is a more modern, not necessarily discovery, I think would be a wrong word to use, but certainly an agreed consensus and one backed with more evidence now. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so that particular study is, again, really famous in academia. So again, little bit into the weeds, but not too much. So the idea of bards, we do see bards in the Odyssey.
Yeah.
But we didn't know if that was Homer imposing themselves into the text. Like, it could have just been a character. There wasn't really any connection being, done there. And then sort of later on through history and academia, people started then making that assumption. Then we have this study that comes out in the 1930s, which was done by Albert Lord and Milman Parry. Guys, bear with me. This sounds really nerdy, but they went to the then called Yugoslavia because they had heard that there were still these communities that would tell these epically long poems through the oral tradition. And this poem, the Odyssey, is over 12,000 lines long. So people just didn't believe you could memorize a poem that long.
Yeah.
So when they went and they actually heard and they recorded some guy doing it, it kind of just made us realize, oh, well, people can memorize 12,000 lines long.
Yeah.
It is entirely possible to perform these. And
there's
therefore,
kind of techniques within that they observed at the time, which then seemed, in my understanding, to map to what we know of Homer, and therefore it's like, oh, well, that has some of the same form and structure, so yeah, I guess that is evidence.
Essentially, and also the way that the text is actually structured leans into oral poetry and like oral storytelling. So, I mean, when you guys start reading, you will see that there are like loads of repeat phrases and like sentences and things like that we think are really bizarre to do in a story. Like, you would never pick up a book that was published like last year or like Fourth Wing or something like that, right? They're not going to have like repeated sentences like every chapter. That would be the marker of, almost to us, like a lazy author. But for this kind of, because it's a poem, for this type of structure, it makes perfect sense because that's how you would kind of, interact with memory, if that makes sense. It would help not only the audience listening to things, especially when we're doing these like repeat phrases for like rosy-fingered dawn. So that's something which describes the morning light in ancient Greek texts. That's something where everybody kind of like calms down, like, oh, okay, we know this, we don't have to pay attention that much. Same for the storyteller. We also have epithets that are reminding us of who each character is. So for Odysseus, it's wily. That leans into the idea of oral storytelling, because if I was telling it, like if I'm just telling you a random story about my friends, for example, and I have, I don't know, a friend that has like maybe striped hair, right? They've like dyed their hair in different stripes. I might say, I've got this friend that has striped hair, then we like keep talking. I might then reference Monique with the striped hair, and you'd be like, oh yeah, Monique with the striped hair. I do remember that little detail.
It certainly sticks in your memory a lot better than just Monique.
Exactly.
Which is quite close to Monique, actually.
Oh, that wasn't even intentional, but look at that. But yeah, so those are kind of the things that work together with the oral storytelling component to it. And obviously the idea that this poem is written to a beat.
Yes.
So that really helps. Even though you probably can't get across the beat, at least the ancient beat, you can't get it across in English.
Right, because in the ancient Greek, it was of one rhythm. And post-translation into English, it is typically of a different rhythm, correct?
Yeah, so we talked about this off camera. Do you remember what both of those were?
I do. Dactylic hexameter is the Greek.
Yes.
And often, but not always, the English translation would be into iambic pentameter.
Yes, often. Again, it's not always. So, you guys are reading Emily Wilson, but for example, there are other translators that don't do that. You can read it as well in prose, so it just comes across as like storytelling. That doesn't have a beat to it, but the ancient beat is dactylic hexameter.
Which is what rhythm?
So I normally have to kind of like demonstrate this.
Sure.
Because the way it sounds like, I describe it as like a war drum. So if you kind of have that like well, I can just do it on my laptop.
Okay, sure.
I mean, if you want it to be on the book, I guess that's
With
fine.
this handy prop that I
Like, yeah, so basically, the way that it is, it sort of sounds like oh, it's weird if I do it that way.
Yeah,
if you do it like a da 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 da, so it's a long, short, short, long, short, short. Or it can be a long, 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 short, short, long, 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 short, short. And I won't get into too much more detail about dactylic hexameter, but because it's done like that and because there's a rhythm to it, we can then infer that actually that does help memory as well when you're orally like telling something. In the same way that I always say, you know, if you're going to try and memorize your favorite artist's like discography or their, you know, a bridge to a song or whatever it is, that's so much easier with music.
And a great example of this that I can attest to personally is I know a lot of pi, and part of the reason I know a lot of pi, the digits of pi, is that there is a song that I don't know if it still exists, but there's a website that you could go to where it was the pi song. And so it would be 3.141592653589793238462643338327 etc etc etc, but to melody, and it really helped when I was originally learning it.
Okay, well, Homer's Meter is better than that one.
Yes, it was more interesting a song than what I just demonstrated, but it was a thing.
I have to believe you because it wasn't very well demonstrated, but that's fine.
You will take my word for it.
I have no choice.
And I will be.
I'm in your home.
Yes, exactly.
I literally have no choice.
Just trust me on that one. So iambic pentameter is the common verse form that English translators will use. A quick note that is worth mentioning here is we in this book club foray are going to be focusing on the Emily Wilson translation, which is in iambic pentameter. The Wilson is also interesting in that it matches Homer line for line.
Yes.
And that's not common, correct?
It's difficult to do.
Right.
So because of the way that ancient Greek is, it's a very specific language. So it's one where they have words for literally everything. And because of that, we don't have as many words on offer in English for a lot of things.
Okay.
So we'll need more words to describe a certain feeling or a certain vibe that they can get in like 1 or 2 words. So this was like a real project, a real undertaking that Wilson did. And like the idea that you can match it to the ancient Greek, I think is so cool for new people.
It's also been useful for me because I can look up a line number and immediately see the Greek line without having to be like, oh, it's shifted a bit because this little chapter went especially long in this other translation. Like, that just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So that's been really nice. It also means that the different axes of translation, you could kind of go in the direction of having very, very flowery language and be really elaborate with the image being conjured up, or you could be very quick and nimble and agile, but potentially shave off some of the fat of the flowery language or what have you. And because Wilson is matching Homer line for line, I think that she does a lot of optimization of speed, and it means that there aren't these massive run-on, extremely verbose sections, which in my understanding, some people see as being plain, but I don't feel is a fair word to use really at all. I think its agility is more so the thing that I'm measuring it on, and it's doing a good job of that. So it is perhaps a simpler set of words to consume. There are fewer of them than if you're reading a longer translation, but personally for me, there isn't value lost in that. There's actually maybe more to read into the choices she's making because every word is considered even more than maybe it would otherwise be because she's trying to make sure that she's sticking to that format. So that's part of the reason we're using the Wilson translation. As we go through this, if you're listening along to this, if you're participating in the book club, etc., you are more than welcome to just read another translation. I have no horse in that race whatsoever. And I think the magic of translations, and I'm sure you would agree with this, is that they all do bring something new to the text, right?
Absolutely. I think the discussion of translations online isn't as nuanced as it is in the real world. You know, when you actually come out and talk to people and academics and all of this, all translations are valid. Like, they're really exciting. They all have their own project. It is important to keep in mind you can't separate a translation from a translator. So the way that translations are done is that it's somebody who is so unbelievably skilled and they're going into the text and they have their own project in mind. So Wilson, her main thing was that she wanted to make sure that the lines matched up. So all of the decisions that she made was having that in the back of her head. Same with any translation you read, right? They've all got an audience in mind, they've got a time period in mind, like they've got a goal. And that means that, like you were saying, you can choose any of them, and especially the ones that, especially if you walk into like Waterstones here in the UK or Barnes & Noble or whatever, like they're all fantastic translations and they're all completely valid. So please pick the one that works for you.
Yes.
Don't be swayed. If this one doesn't work for you, that's completely fine. There are other ones. Fagles is really popular in the US.
Very, very popular.
Yeah. So, you know, that's a really good one as well. It's just whatever works.
And the way I made this choice for myself is there's a video on YouTube by a guy called Benjamin McAvoy, and he goes through a handful of different translations and reads you an excerpt that is matched between the different translations so you can hear the different takes. And obviously, there's only so much you can get from a couple of lines, but it is actually very, very informative immediately. And I, without knowing anything else about Wilson's goal and the form choices she was making, just liked the style. And so I was like, well, that resonates with me. I'd like to pursue that. And if you watch that video and you're inspired by and enamored with a different translation, then by all means, the underlying text that we are referencing is still the same thing. Now, the referencing to that underlying text is a can of worms.
Yes.
Because the time period of all of this and what has survived history is complex, right? So let's spend a moment talking about where the story of the Odyssey fits in the historic record, and then we can move on and talk a little about how these words have survived until now and what changes there may have been made to that through history. So first of all, when-ish is it from? And is there a difference in the story itself in terms of its time anchor?
Big can of worms. Cool.
Yeah.
So we're going to start with when is the Odyssey from? The Odyssey, as well as the Iliad, it's really hard to not talk about both of them.
Sure.
But they're both from the same time period, and they come to us from about 750-ish BCE. So this is the 8th century BCE, very long time ago, but they're not set during that time period. So the actual setting of the story is what we call the Mycenaean period of Greece. This is like 1100, 1200 BCE. So we don't really need to be like focusing. You just need to know there's a time gap between when Homer is telling us the story and when the story is set.
And it's a pretty long amount of time, 500 years.
Is that the maths?
Ish.
I'm really bad at maths, so I don't know.
It's ish. It depends which end of it's ish.
Sure. Cool.
If we were to think 500 years back in our past, that's a pretty long time.
Yeah.
So obviously back then, it would have been, I would guess at least, interesting for the people listening to the story to hear a tale being told about something in maybe their ancestors' past kind of thing.
Yeah, there's this huge element of like harking back to that time of heroes. And in particular with the Trojan War, more widely speaking, it encompasses so many people throughout the Mediterranean, and because the Mediterranean is so expansive at that time, you have lots of heroes that are from the Trojan War that then people are hearing about and connecting to. Right? So there's this like huge element that throughout the entire Mediterranean, people are like, oh, there's me, or like, there's my people. Like, that's a really cool thing that they can always trace their lineage, not necessarily back to the person, but at least have a representative of them, which is like something very special. It's something that we don't really have now with, like, for example, the Avengers. Like, people watch that because it's really cool.
But at the same time, people are always very excited when they feel represented on screen.
Yes.
And it is, I guess, a similar, more historic version of
Exactly.
that.
If we could combine that with the Avengers, because that's how they would have like seen these heroes, especially because a lot of them are like half god, like these are all these like insane characters. So if you combine both those ideas, that's exactly the relationship that they would have had
Right.
to these kinds of characters. It would have been very cool, like all of that kind of stuff up on a pedestal. But the story of Homer, so even though it comes down to us from the 8th century BCE, we then have like time that passes. And this is the big problem, because obviously that is an age away. So how does a story like this survive? So actually, the earliest surviving manuscript of the Homeric Greek comes to us from the 9th century CE.
Wow.
Yeah, so much, much, much later.
Yeah.
And whenever people say I'm going back into the ancient Greek, I say this all the time on my channel. When I'm like, let me go check the ancient Greek, that's the Greek that we're talking about.
Yeah.
So that survived from scribes who are copying it and valuing it and basically caring
That's
about.
so much later.
Yeah. But that's the earliest full manuscript of this story
So
that we have.
that means that when someone is being precious about the specific given word that Homer might have used, we do have to recognize we have this gargantuan gap where that word might have changed in all of that time and we wouldn't know now.
Could have. I don't
Yeah.
know if there's any benefit in arguing that.
Yeah.
Just because it's very tricky from our neck of the woods, we don't have anything necessarily to compare it
Sure.
to. However, we do know that this was a big topic amongst antiquity anyways.
Okay.
And when it comes to the Library of Alexandria, we're just going to kind of make this very general, right? When it comes
sure.
to the Library of Alexandria, just to kind of keep dates out of this as much as possible.
Yeah.
We do know that they are getting an influx of scrolls that are Homeric poetry.
Okay.
And when they get, okay guys, if you don't know about like the Library of Alexandria, we do have this very large library in Alexandria, the place in like Egypt in North Africa. And when it comes to this place, this is like known for housing all of the texts from
This
the
is
ancient
in
world.
history for the record. This is not today.
Yeah, no. Oh my God, if it was today.
Yeah, if only.
Wow. No, so this is like in antiquity, there are some numbers that state that they had like 700,000 books.
Pretty good catalogue.
Huge.
Yeah.
They were super sneaky with like steel books, all of this kind of jazz. Anywho, they are getting an influx of Homer, and in particular the Odyssey. And unfortunately, when all of these scrolls are coming in, they are slightly different. All of them are just ever so slightly different from the other one. And all of the scholars, this is very long story short, all the scholars get like really frustrated by this, and so they decide to sit down and they pick out the parts that are the same, and they try to come up with this one text of
Yeah.
Homer's Odyssey, which is what we're going to just focus on.
Essentially the most agreed upon parts.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that is what we have that survives, that it's essentially because of all of these. And for people who are wondering, oh, where can I find other lines of Homer? You can find them in Plato. So this is a good one that I like to point people to.
Okay.
If you check Plato's texts, he will quote the Odyssey, and we don't have those lines in this Odyssey.
Right.
Now that doesn't indicate, before people like run off and say there were two versions of the Odyssey, it doesn't indicate that. He could have just misquoted them. It's entirely possible. I do this on my channel all the time where I'll say, he said, and then blah, 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 and I just kind of like make something sound funny. Entirely possible that Plato did that.
Yeah.
But also because he didn't say that, we do have to kind of have that with a grain of salt. What did Plato have a different version of the Odyssey than this one?
And if it's oral poetry, I suspect that it would not be exactly to the specific word every single time in every recitation. And so you'd expect there to be a little wiggle with
Yes.
what word was used in a given moment. And so it makes complete sense to me that those discrepancies would be there. And then when the notation and the inscribing and the writing down of this would have become more and more and more popular, that you would then have lots of different slightly competing versions that would then need to be unified, I guess, by the Library of Alexandria in this case.
Yeah.
So
Which even, just as a note,
Yeah.
they disagreed. Like the scholars in Alexandria disagreed
Right.
about a lot of things.
Yeah.
So we also know that there were some people who were like, oh, this isn't Homer, and some people who say this must be Homer. So it wasn't just like a unanimous,
Perfect.
easy thing.
Yeah.
It was like quite a controversial thing at the time in the
Yeah.
library. They were like, I don't know if I can commit to this.
Yeah. So controversial then, and so now looking back at that, and also then looking back at Homer, something that I'm learning in my classics journey here is there are just a huge number of things that we don't know, and it is sort of fine to make guesses at and theorize about a lot of things and to try to draw conclusions from the sort of limited data set of evidence that exists. But there are just massive gaps.
Yes.
And that will be something that we always have to contend with. And I think it probably means that making too bold a proclamation now about something may actually not be something that is very well founded, because we kind of have to say that we don't know a lot of the time, because there are these sort of missing links in the record, unfortunately.
Yeah, when it comes to sort of like the academic stuff that we've sort of been touching on at the moment, it's more so a case of, okay, well, most people agree.
Yeah.
That's kind of the arguments that are being placed forward, like Homer being a bard. Okay, well, thanks to that study in the 1930s, most people agree. I am sure there are still people that don't agree, but most people agree, okay, well, this matches up pretty well. We can now state this with as much factual evidence as humanly possible.
Yeah, it's even Homer's name is in contention, right?
Yeah, so we don't really know where this name came from. This isn't like a normal Greek personal name that we see before. It's also not a name that anybody questions, which is also interesting. So it's not like it was too foreign that people were like, whoa, what's that? So it's a really bizarre name that's just sort of comes into existence and then just kind of never goes away. But then there are like loads of theories about where it could have possibly come from. There's one, I don't know if I could go into this in too much detail, but there's one where people think that it means hostage.
Okay.
Because, okay, this is going to sound really weird.
Go there.
There is a story from an ancient source where basically they have claimed that there was, on the island of Chios, right, in Greece, on the island of Chios, there was this ritualistic hostage situation that women would reenact. Okay, bear with me. And one of the women could have possibly gotten pregnant and then given birth to a baby and then called the baby hostage, like after the ceremony.
I love my hostage so much.
Yeah,
my little hostage.
There's no evidence for the name Homer actually being linked to the word hostage.
Right.
It's just a theory.
Yeah.
And it's one that, it's like the only one that we have. So there's a big question mark about where that name comes from. And that's why these conversations stick to academia.
Yeah.
Because we have time to do things, but everybody else, like, no one really cares. It's just the name on the front of the book.
Clearly, there is a massive amount that we don't know about the text. But thankfully, the text in itself we have, and we have our version of it that has survived. And there are, as described earlier, several layers to the text that we can kind of unpack.
Yes.
There's, at the very highest level, which we'll talk about for a moment here, the plot, and then we kind of go deeper down the rungs of Iceberg into some of the more unusual things that you can kind of maybe sense in the tea leaves, so to speak. So let's start with the plot. I think that it would be fair to say that this is an interesting plot because it is as complex as it is. There's a lot of jumping between different scenes and different characters in different places, and also jumps through time where we've got flashbacks and all sorts of stuff like that. And is that something that is unusual about the Odyssey, would you say? Is it remarkable, or is that something that I would imagine seeing in the Iliad and other sort of similarly
Well, the Iliad isn't structured the same way.
No.
The Iliad is a linear story.
It is, okay.
Yes, so that story is told completely linearly.
Right.
We get dropped into, this is just in case you guys are curious about reading the Iliad, you get dropped into the 9th year of the war, and we get dropped into an argument that Achilles and Agamemnon are having, and then all the narrative afterwards is because of that argument. Now Achilles doesn't want to fight, and then they try and talk to him, and then he won't talk, and then blah, blah, blah. All of that kind of happens until Achilles then decides to come back. Oh, spoilers, but also not spoilers, because it's 2,000 years old. But still, then he decides to come back out into battle. So that's linear.
Yep.
So as long as you can keep track of the characters, you're good, because there are quite a few characters. The Odyssey, it isn't like, just considering, I guess, these are the first two texts. It's very difficult for us to say, like, this is unique or this is different, because we don't know what other texts were existing at the time and how they told other stories at the time. But this is not told linearly. So when we pick up in the Odyssey, we open on Ithaca. And so it's present day on Ithaca. We get to see the mayhem that has ensued. Then we meet Odysseus, and then he tells us the story of how he got to where he is, and he tells it to us in flashback, right? So he goes, okay, well, from Troy, I then made it here by doing X, Y, and Z, and blah, 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 all that happened. And then we snap back to the regular narrative, the regular plot, and then do present.
Right.
So it is present, flashback, present. And that's important to the storyline. You will very rarely, I say very rarely because I know that there is going to be one rendition of the story out there that I just haven't seen.
Sure.
But very rarely do you see anyone depict the Odyssey that way. They will tell it to you in linear order. So they'll start on the shores of Troy, and they will then follow Odysseus all the way home back to Ithaca.
Yeah. So on that journey, there are lots of characters that you're introduced to. And one of the things that I think the cohort of readers in the book club will immediately be perhaps a little thrown by is that there's essentially a huge cast of people. You don't really know who's relevant, who's not, who should I be paying attention to, whose name I should bother to remember. Is there a guide that we can go through for who would be worth paying a specific attention to in some of those opening chapters, or as they're referred to, books? Or what? Like, who should we keep an eye out for maybe in the opening section of the text?
Odysseus.
Okay.
It's probably the most important one.
Yep.
Anybody Odysseus' family, they're all going to be relevant. It's interesting even that you talk about like how there are lots of different people, like who should we pay attention to, who shouldn't we? I think in the Odyssey, generally speaking, everybody's pretty important when we look at them. Obviously to differing degrees, we can get into that. But all of them are kind of important. Whereas like when you read the Iliad, which you guys aren't doing yet, but like that's one where you will like read a whole character's backstory for like 3 pages, you get really attached to them, and then Homer's like, and then they were speared. And you're like, well,
Okay.
I didn't need to know any of that. And then you just move on to the next character that was killed in a different way, and so on and so forth.
Okay.
But the thing with the Odyssey is that it includes so many characters that we already know, or that we've already met, or stories that are particularly famous at this particular time period, or even in the later ancient Greek world. So there are lots of names that maybe some of you guys will find familiar, and maybe you might be wondering, like, why are they here? Like that, I could totally see that happening, in particular in the Underworld episode when that comes up in book 11. There are so many references to people like Heracles and all of that kind of stuff. All of them are relevant to the story. They're all trying to either pull you in to this mythological world, make you feel a little bit familiar with them, or they're characters that we saw in the Iliad and would have seen in this wider sort of Trojan War story. Like in the first 4 books, first 4 chapters, we see Menelaus and Helen in Sparta, who, even though they just kind of slot in here, we've had like a whole book with them. Like if you read the Iliad, we spent a lot of time with both of those characters.
So the audience listening to this
would have known.
and would have had opinions, I imagine, about those characters as well. There might be one that they might cheer for, and another they might be like, I hate that guy.
Absolutely. They would have had their own little relationships with them. So seeing those characters and having them speak in particular, like, you know, to have full-on conversations with Menelaus, we're like, I know him, like, great.
Right.
Same with Nestor, who we meet right before then. Nestor's a particularly difficult character for a lot of new readers, and I get it. Nestor is an old man. In the Iliad, he's like the old counselor. So he's there because he offers like sage advice. I do make jokes about Nestor constantly because he does just kind of talk like an old man, like he just runs on for pages and pages.
Okay.
And so people will get kind of bored with Nestor, but that is his character. Like that. So people who were listening to this back in the day, they would have been like, oh yeah, that's just Nestor doing Nestor.
Yeah.
Like that would have been a very familiar thing.
It would have felt appropriate.
Absolutely. And if you read this and then you read the Iliad, you'll also be like when you go read the Iliad, you'll feel like, oh, okay, like I know this guy, like he did this in the Odyssey. That's kind of the same thing. So when we have those characters, I understand that in particular with Nestor and Menelaus, I think because they kind of pop out of nowhere and they don't really have introductions. It's just sort of like, go see them. And then Telemachus, who's Odysseus' son, he then goes and he talks to them. But yeah, people who are familiar with this wider Trojan War story would have been very familiar with them.
So that's in the opening 4 books. We have both of those characters being visited, and there's lots of conversation with them. There is also, even earlier than that, the mention of Orestes.
Yes.
Can you give us some context as to why that might be relevant and what we should look out for from that going through the rest of the entire text?
So the opening of the book, most people miss this out, but the opening of the book is a conversation about what's happened to Agamemnon when he returns home from the Trojan War. So just as a little reminder, the Trojan War was 10 years long. Agamemnon leads the Greeks into, even though there's no such thing as the Greeks in this time period, but that's not the point of this.
Sure.
But still, he leads the Greeks into war against Troy. So he's the leader. And he goes home to Mycenae, and when he goes home, very famously, he gets killed by his wife, Clytemnestra. And she has shacked up with his cousin in the last 10 years, and so they've been canoodling together to make this murder happen. Now, Orestes, who is Clytemnestra and Agamemnon's son, he's away from Mycenae, but he hears of this. And there's this huge thing in the ancient Greek world that is your revenge arc, right? We still love this, nowadays in lots of sci-fi films, we have a revenge arc, all of that kind of stuff, but it's very prominent in the ancient world. And so when Orestes comes back, he then has to avenge his father's killer, who just so happens to be his mum. It's really he doesn't really focus on that thing. He's just kind of I've got to do this for my dad.
Yeah.
And Clytemnestra does supposedly try, this is from later sources, she does supposedly try to be oh, but don't you love me? And he's no. So does it anyways. Now, the reason why this is important is because it obviously includes Agamemnon, who we have a hyper focus on in the Iliad. So everybody listening to this story back in the ancient world,
Odyssey,
the Odyssey,
yes.
they would have known this.
Right.
So they would have been very familiar with him. He's already, in the Iliad, there's one mention of Clytemnestra because he has his slave girl. It's a very long story, but he has his slave girl taken away. And he says, well, that's not fair because I love her more than I love my wife, Clytemnestra. Ooh. And you're reading it going, no one asked. Not a soul asked for that piece of opinion. But sure, thanks for that.
Yeah.
And so people have that relationship with him, they know of him. And then hearing about this at the start of it wouldn't have been as jarring as it potentially could be to a new reader.
That would mean the story was introduced with the Iliad or the character.
Yes.
To the extent that listeners would know Agamemnon and know about what had happened, and then jumping straight into that in the Odyssey, it would actually have been maybe nice because they'd have immediately been met with something familiar that they could go, oh, I know what's going on here. Yeah, this is a familiar cast of characters. And the story of Orestes then going on that revenge arc is, I guess, something that is then paralleled a little bit in the Odyssey, or there's the question of to what extent it's paralleled, maybe.
Yeah, so it's basically the hot gossip. So the audience, we can't say if they would have been familiar with Orestes or any of that kind of stuff, because in the Iliad, we don't meet him. Okay. So we just meet Agamemnon, and he mentions Clytemnestra once.
And that's the extent of it, right?
Yes, there are other books in this cycle that would have been, and other parts of the story of this cycle, which we call the epic cycle, as a sort of academic note to them.
Yep.
But there were 8 books in this, so potentially in the other books, there would have been reference to the Orestes, or Orestes as a character or something like that.
And when we're saying cycle here, the Odyssey is one of the 8 books in the cycle.
Yes.
The Iliad is also one of the books in the cycle.
Yes.
But then the other 6 books are all lost to time?
Yes. So we have sort of 5 lines here, or we have 10 lines here of another book, and we have summaries of these books.
Okay.
So we know what order the story would have been told.
Okay,
so there's
wonderful.
a first book, which is called the Cypria or the Cypria, depending on if that's a hard C or soft C to you. And then it would have gone into the Iliad. And then we have the next array of books, and then book number 7 was the Odyssey.
Right.
And then we have book 8, which would have been the Telegony.
Okay, so depending on the listener's familiarity with the wider cycle at the time, they might have been more familiar or less familiar with a given character.
Yeah, I don't know if Orestes pops up in any of the other ones. I don't know if we get more of an eyeball on Clytemnestra. I frequently say on my channel, I hope we do, I wish we do. If we find something that would be amazing.
Yeah.
I don't know, and I can't sit here and say that.
Yeah.
But absolutely Agamemnon, we know, is in the Iliad, so we know that they would have had a familiarity with him. And then yes, the Orestes saga is really important to open on, because the Odyssey, it is a very light, mythological story in the sense you do get monsters and magic and all of those sorts of things that people love. But it is also a really dark story. There are some very dark undertones, especially when you get towards the end of the story. And having the Orestes saga open it kind of shows you that, where it's okay, there is this sort of dark underbelly to society of these things that are allowed. Now, would they have seen necessarily as being dark in the ancient world or as expected? That's also another question mark that's there. But for us, certainly, it might come across to a modern reader as a bit, morbid, like this son who's coming back. Well, to be fair, in the ancient world, you still couldn't like go around killing your mom, right? That's like not allowed. But the revenge arc might have kind of halved that, if that makes sense.
Sure.
But yeah, so the Orestes saga is the hot gossip though. Anytime Homer thinks you're going to forget about the Orestes saga, somebody brings it up. Somebody's like, did you hear what happened to Agamemnon? We even meet Agamemnon in the underworld and he's like, did you hear what happened to me? If not, I'll tell you.
Yeah. And so what I think Homer therefore is doing is saying, this is the hot gossip, and this is something which the audience would have a moral opinion of, I'm sure, and then there is a similar scenario presented of Telemachus, a boy with an absent father who has to make decisions about how he's going to behave in his story, and the Orestes story is potential contrast to that, I would argue.
I wouldn't necessarily parallel Orestes to Telemachus.
No?
I
Okay.
would parallel sort of the idea of the revenge arc to Odysseus.
Oh,
when Odysseus has
interesting.
to return home, you haven't got there yet, so you get it.
Sure.
But when he has to return home, there is this idea of like, oh, do I spoil it? Are we doing spoilers? Like on my channel, there's no such thing as a spoiler.
I mean,
but if you guys are doing a book club,
well, it's certainly in the context of the Orestes story, I can say that the Agamemnon is killed upon his return, right?
Yes.
And therefore in this, the question posed a lot of, is Odysseus going to be safe on his return?
Yes.
And he takes measures to be safe.
Yes.
Right? And
that is a very good non-spoilery way of saying that, in case anybody is like, well, with
Yeah.
spoilers. Yes, so there is that element to it, where we are reminded of this because Odysseus is going to have to, he's the only hero who hasn't gotten home yet. He's the only one, out of everybody else that survived the Trojan War, he is the last guy to make it home. And so therefore, knowing that this is sort of happening in the background of like, well, Agamemnon was the leader, and even he survived 10 years of war and couldn't survive his wife when he came home.
Right.
So because of this, Odysseus doesn't know what he's coming home to. There is this big question of like, sure, with Telemachus, I guess, but it's not really paralleled in this way. Like, could Telemachus want to kill him? Probably not, but like, in the case of Penelope, we're told multiple times throughout the text, you don't have to worry about Penelope. She's really lovely, she's really loyal, that's like not a genuine worry, even though Agamemnon does kind of yell about women being mean.
And even Odysseus does sort of check to make sure.
Yes.
Right?
Even though, again, like it is said, like Penelope is supposed to be the ideal woman. So it is said constantly throughout the text, like, she's great, she's loyal, you don't have to worry. We're shown her being absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
But the point of that storyline with the Orestes thing is that when Odysseus is careful and he is cautious, as the reader, we're not like, why is he doing that? Like, why is he such a weirdo?
Yeah, so it justifies a lot of his actions, I suppose.
Absolutely, especially at the end with a lot of the bloodshed that happens.
Right.
It's all completely justified with this storyline in mind. That's not to say with the modern audience that it is. You can obviously have your own opinions and thoughts and all of that, but within its ancient context of storytelling, yes, absolutely.
Perfect. So look out for the Orestes story, and I would say something that we will examine as we go through the text is exactly what we've just begun talking about here, where the parallels are, where the parallels aren't as well, and where the similarities of the two stories are not employed by Homer, like where Homer says actually it's different here and Penelope isn't gonna kill her husband, and what that means for the wider story. I think that's an interesting thing for us to kind of unpack a bit. Now, through not just those opening books, but the entire thing, due to the form, the oral poetry of the text, there is a lot of stuff that you'll spot, which we briefly alluded to earlier, the epithets, and even just the scenes themselves, which are idiosyncratic. You can look at them and kind of tell that there's something unusual going on there. So can you help prime us for what an epithet is, maybe to start with, and then we can dig into that further.
Yeah, so an epithet basically describes a person. So like I mentioned earlier, like if you're gonna have like a friend called Monique and then you're gonna say she's got striped hair or whatever you kind of decide for someone. I'm sure that everybody has that for all of their friends when they're talking to people that don't know them. That's essentially what an epithet is, but these are very uniform in the ancient text. So you tend to have like one or two, and that's about it. So Odysseus is wily Odysseus. Now this would have helped not only the bard who's telling the story like wily Odysseus, but also us. If we're listening to like hours and hours and hours of this, potentially, right? That's not to say that every single performance was hours long. It might have just been 30 minutes. You might have just zoned out at the start of it and then you come back into it. That helps you remember who they are. And that's literally the purpose of it. So to make that very, very clear, you are going to see a lot of epithets repeated. This is going to seem very bizarre, but you have to bear that performance. Like I will probably repeat this like 12 times in our conversation because it is so bizarre for a modern reader, but is so expected with the oral side of this.
Now there is a quirk to the Wilson, which is that she makes the conscious choice, this was a considered choice, it's not an accident, to use different English translations of a given epithet. So where some translations, at least to my understanding, will look at an epithet for Athena, for example, and Athena will be grey-eyed Athena, and that will be the phrase. Wilson will, in some instances, use grey-eyed Athena, but then in others will say Athena of the owl eyes or the flashing eyes, or she'll use other possible translations of the same epithet.
Yeah, there's different technically.
Oh.
Yeah. So, like, those are just different things.
Oh, that's a misunderstanding on my part then.
It's kind of the same as, like, when you see Odysseus, he'll be, like, wily Odysseus, but then he'll sometimes be Odysseus, son of Laertes. Like, it's just another way. So, like, Hera is referred to as having, like, this sounds really weird, but she has, like, cow eyes.
Sure.
That was, like, a nice thing. That's not, like, it sounds rude in English, but it wasn't.
Sure.
So, they have, like, a number of those different markers.
Yeah.
That will just kind of tell you about what they look like. So like Athena's grey eyes are just like a very clear marker of who she is. But yeah, you have a number of these sometimes. You'll have like one, so wily Odysseus is the most famous, that's the most repeated one. But you will see Odysseus, son of Laertes, you will see other ones. You will see different ones for Athena.
Gotcha.
And unfortunately, and I say unfortunately, it's really easy to get used to this, but you do just have to get used to it.
Yeah.
And it is something that you just need to learn because sometimes they will say the grey-eyed goddess, and you've just got to know, oh, that's Athena. That has nothing to do with anybody else.
Yeah.
So you are, sort of piecing things together there.
Similarly, there is repetition in scene structures very frequently where you'll start reading and you'll get through those first couple of chapters, books, and you'll start to think, why do they always have the bread first and then they like sit down at the table and then they tell a story? Like, why is it structured in this way? But that is, again, partly for the benefit, I guess, of the bard to remember what's going on. But then also there are customs that we are learning about through those repetitions, which are not always held up. Sometimes there's contravention to those customs and the rules are broken, and we learn about what happens when you break the rules. So let's talk a little bit about that. I think this probably is a good place to introduce Xenia or Xenia as a topic, and that, as far as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, translates to guest friendship.
Yeah, hospitality I always use as well.
Perfect.
Just 'cause I think that's kind of like an easier modern
guest friendship was a bit of a weird
like
thing
when you
to
say that in conversation, people are like, what the hell does that mean? So I just say hospitality.
Yeah, wonderful. And I would say that Xenia is a theme really that Homer explores throughout the entire text. There's constant examples of Xenia being employed in a way that he, I think, or they would have seen as the correct way to do it. And then there are also the rule breakers. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So guest friendship is vital to the ancient world. This is a huge thing. You must be a good host, but you must also be a good guest.
Yeah.
So like if I, for example, was like a random traveler and I had just come and like knocked on the door and I was like, I'm completely lost, blah, blah. Nowadays, you like wouldn't let that person in necessarily. It depends where you are, obviously. It depends the time of day. Like it depends who it is. There are all of these things that it would be very normal for us to be hesitant. In the ancient world, not a thing. If somebody comes knocking on your door in the middle of the night and they're like, I need a place to stay, you let them in. Like, you're supposed to be a very good host, but also you must be a good guest. Like, they're not supposed to overstay their welcome.
Yes.
They're supposed to have very good manners. You know, all of these sorts of things, it's a balance. And in particular in the Odyssey, that is explored throughout the entire text in multiple different ways. So this is going to seem a little redundant when you're reading the text, because you do have lots of instances of it, you know, somebody being like, we need to go and find a host. And then you have this back and forth that happens, but they're slightly different each and every time. And it's just so that you can see examples of good host, bad host, good guest, bad guest. A really famous one is the Cyclops. That's an instance where Odysseus walks in and is a horrible guest. He just shows up and walks into this cave. It'll make sense when you get to it. But he walks into this random cave and they're like, we'll just make ourselves comfortable.
Yeah.
And everybody reading that is like, if I just came home and somebody was sitting at my kitchen table, I too would pop off. Like, that's not polite.
Right.
At the same time, Polyphemus, who lives in the cave.
Who is the Cyclops for the
He's
record?
a Cyclops. Yeah, he is also a really bad host because when he comes in, he decides to like start eating Odysseus's men. So there's also then, well, he's a bad host.
Right.
Who's the worst?
Yeah.
The suitors on Ithaca, who we open the story with.
So those are the people that are trying to take Penelope's hand in marriage while Odysseus is gone.
Yes, which, little caveat, they have every right to do this. Like, I think a lot of people read this and they're like, this is really rude. So Odysseus has been away for 20 years.
Right.
And this is a boat journey that should only take him about 10 days.
Wow.
Like,
Is that short?
It really is not that long. So
Okay.
they've actually all been very polite and leaving it. They've actually left it, I think, about 7 years because they had descended on the island about 2 or 3 years prior.
Okay.
They are then also like the worst guests ever. They are horrendous. They are rude. We see them literally throw hooves and stools at people,
lovely.
including Odysseus in disguise when he returns.
Charming.
Yeah, so they're really very, like, really bad guests. So yeah, this is, I mean, that was a whole tangent to just say, you are going to experience this, and this is something that is very normal, and the people who are listening to this would have gone in and they would have been, oh, that was bad. Oh no, how's that gonna go? Or like, oh, Penelope, for example, fabulous host.
Right.
She's a great host, which adds to her being the ideal wife, that they would have been like, okay, we can't fault her, because she's not kicking them out. She is, you know, being really wonderful, feeding them every single night, all of this kind of stuff. They're just being mean to her. So yeah, for the audience, it would have been normal. For us, it's weird.
One of my favorite examples of this that I've noticed in what I've read so far is scenarios where someone wants to leave and the method through which they say that they want to leave, and there's a bit of a dance that the two people will go through in terms of being like, well, I would never keep you longer than you wanted to be here. And it clearly is a war of politeness, essentially, that is happening.
as well.
And the gifts then come into it.
For good hosts and good guests, yes, there's always an exchange of gifts, which is like, oh, we can't send you on your way without giving you something that you can then go home with to say, oh, I was hosted by these people in this place and look at this wonderful thing. Yeah, there's always that kind of, especially with like Menelaus and Telemachus, there's a big sort of like, oh, when do you go? Is it okay for you to go now? You don't have to go now, you can stay.
Yeah, and what's nice, I think, about this is it does tell us also about what, outside of the story, the real Greek customs may have been, or may have been close to, I suppose. Because we have limited information about the time period, there's a whole lot of people doing relatively normal things in this, and you could probably draw a lot of conclusions to say, oh, well, that must have been pretty pervasive through society, and therefore we reckon that a lot of the Greeks were up to these sorts of expressions of hospitality and the such.
Yeah, in particular with the myths as well. Like, myths are often used to explain things or to kind of show customs and those sorts of things, just generally speaking.
Okay.
And when we look at like the idea of hospitality, I presume, you know, a number of people when they're reading mythology may have read Ovid. So Ovid is a Roman writer, but he's rewriting Greek myths. And there are a couple of ones in there that are very big on hospitality. There's one that, if you guys don't know, it's actually well cute. It's this one called Philemon and Baucis, and it's about this really old couple. And the Greek versions of these names would be Zeus and Hermes come down, and they're knocking on everybody's door in the town, and they come to Philemon and Baucis' house. and they are the only couple to like let them in, and they're really, really poor, and they like give them the best of everything that they have. And at the end of the story, the gods take them up to like this hill, and they're like, you guys are the only people that let us in, and then they just like wipe out the rest of the village.
Oh wow.
And then the old couple are like, well, I guess you can turn us into trees as your gift to us so that we can like die together. It's actually really sweet.
Lovely.
Even though they wipe out an entire town because they weren't hospitable.
Right.
So, you know, this is just an example of like, you will see it in other places. And so we can, sort of infer from that about what people are actually doing. If it's that prevalent in their stories, it wouldn't have been such an alien thing.
Yeah, and it also would be something which might have been a stranger choice to explore as such a sort of core theme here, because I think there's a huge amount in this particular text in the Odyssey which feels like Homer kind of taking positions on certain things, and one of those positions very much is extending Xenia to a guest and being hospitable to a guest is always the thing you should do.
Yeah.
He's like kind of proselytizing a little bit. He's sort of saying like, this is really what we should all be doing, guys. And I suspect the audience would have agreed and resonated with that. Maybe.
Suspect is a good,
Suspect being the key word.
We don't have written things from the audience.
Yeah.
So
we really don't know. So from that theme of Xenia, we then can go another layer deeper and start to ask, what else is Homer prodding at? What is being explored here? And the very opening book focuses a lot on Telemachus being a boy with an absent father who has struggled to become a man, and the gods sort of feel like it's time for him to change that a little bit. And I think he wants to become a man as well, doesn't really know how to go about it, but you're set up immediately with this idea of, oh, maybe his ascent to manhood is going to be important. But then by contrast, we have his father, who is one of the manliest men that we know of in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Like he's such a prototypical man, and he has been away, outcast, stuck on this island for such a long time, and he has to reintegrate into society and figure out what it means to be a man that's been away for a really long time. So growth from boyhood to manhood, or from being a man to being a man who moves through time, is something that I think Homer digs into a lot here. I think the Odysseus side of it is probably more heavily explored. The Telemachus stuff is there, but maybe a little bit less really wrenched open compared. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think that Telemachus is kind of sort of dropped in there.
Okay.
Where he certainly is like, I mean, the important part of his character is that he's about to ascend into manhood.
Yeah.
Like he's like right on that
cusp.
age, yeah. And that's sort of the problem that the suitors have with him, because the minute he ascends into manhood, he can just kind of step up and rule the place. So they need to come in there and be king before that happens. So the big sort of struggle between them and Telemachus is we need to get rid of him before that happens, because I want to be king.
Yeah.
What's going on here? And that's sort of an element to it. But I think it's interesting you were talking about Odysseus being like this prototype of like man and like very manly and all of this, because I think a lot of people are surprised when they first meet him. Like the first time we meet him is in book 5, chapter 5. So the first 4 books do not actually show us Odysseus, which is interesting. I started posting on TikTok, so I've gotten like a lot of the TikTok audience.
Hell yeah.
And all of them are now starting to read the Odyssey, and they're commenting on my posts being like,
where is
the
he?
right book? Is this the right one? And I'm like, yes, then keep going, you'll find him eventually.
Yeah.
And when you meet him in book 5, he's actually on the shores of an island, and he's sobbing.
Yeah.
He's looking off into the distance, he is shaking, he's crying so hard, and he's trying to see Ithaca on the horizon. And I think we wouldn't often, like, sort of in the modern day where we're thinking of like a prototypical man or being very manly, you wouldn't associate that image with that.
Fair.
even though the ancient Greeks would have. Like, we see loads of men cry throughout the Odyssey and the Iliad.
It's something I've actually noted here several times, is I'm like, everyone is just constantly crying.
Yes, and they're allowed to.
Yeah.
There's no one who's like, you're a baby. Helen does drug her husband, minus her, minus Helen.
Sure.
Who's just a very savage character. I think most people don't anticipate that about Helen, but she really, like, her tolerance level is so low for things. Yeah. But aside from her, men are just allowed to cry. They're allowed to kind of feel those things. And Odysseus cries so often throughout the book. And so I think that's kind of a surprise for people, that yes, he is a very manly man, but not how we would necessarily look at a manly man.
Yeah.
But he is what the ancient Greeks would have considered a manly man.
Right, okay, yeah. And I think his strength and his mental acuity and prowess is something which the book explores a lot, but it then also shows how incredibly flawed he is. And I found that quite interesting in what I've read so far, in tracing through, okay, he's not just a guy that is the best at everything, but actually he's a guy that messes up constantly and sort of survives in spite of how terrible he ends up being in a given moment. His ego seems to get in the way quite often. He seems to be quite quick to anger, and there's a question, I guess, to ask of, to what extent, having had the history that he would have had because he was in the horse, right? It might have even been his idea to be in the horse. Yeah. So he's engaged in really terrible battle, has then been away for so long. That's going to traumatize even the most steely-hearted of person, and you sort of see that come out in his brashness at times, and that, I think, has been an interesting thread for me to follow, and I'd encourage you guys listening to sort of look out for instances of that happening as well, because it isn't just he's a bit grumpy sometimes.
Yeah.
But you sort of wonder, well, why? And maybe if you look back at his history and the circumstances, you can be sympathetic for that grumpiness in a way that you otherwise wouldn't be.
Yeah.
The example that maybe is most apparent to me, that we'll obviously get to, is when he just can't help but yell back his name.
Oh God.
And in a scenario where, again, we'll get there, but in a scenario where if he just went on his merry way and didn't feel the need to kind of big up his ego a little bit, he'd have been a lot safer. But instead, he's got to assert himself. It's so important to him. And that's actually maybe a very quick tangent that we should go on, just to introduce the concept of Kleos.
Okay, yeah.
Can you give us some context on what that is and why it's relevant, what the Greeks were interested in with this concept of Kleos?
It's this idea of sort of like honor and glory, and it's mostly prevalent in the Iliad. That's really where we see it a lot. Like, that's what they're fighting for, is this idea of Kleos.
Yeah.
It's like one of the central themes to that. And so Odysseus is coming off the back end of that, absolutely. In particular, at that episode, he still has a lot of his men are alive, which is great because they don't survive the story.
Yeah.
But he has a lot of that with him. And I think more so what's important with regards to that is just kind of the characteristics that come with that. There's a lot of arrogance, there's a lot of ego, there's a lot of those things that, as you were describing with Odysseus, that are very important to his character. And I think what a lot of people will read into this is that they'll say, oh, well, Odysseus is a hero, but he is arrogant, but he is this, but he is that. And that doesn't align with our definition of hero.
Right.
Which is really interesting because in the ancient Greek, the word hero doesn't have the same definition as we have for hero.
Oh.
So when it comes to this discussion of Kleos and heroic qualities that the ancient Greeks saw, they don't mirror ours. Because in the ancient Greek, when they use the word hero, so Odysseus is a hero.
Yeah.
And Agamemnon, like all of these great men from the Iliad are heroes.
Yep.
You only have to be, in the ancient Greek, to be called a hero, you only have to be either descended from a god,
okay,
or favored by a god.
That's it?
That's it.
Wow.
You do not have to have any moral qualities whatsoever. You don't have to be a nice guy. You don't have to do charity, like nothing.
There's no action. There's no save the princess moment. It's just, yeah.
That's it. If the gods like you, or if you are the child of a god, or whatever happens to be, done, dusted. Like, easy peasy, you'll be called a hero.
Wow.
So that's why we see a lot of these weird episodes with Odysseus, like when he is absolutely unbelievably arrogant and you're like, are you serious? Like, if you just if you just shut up, this book would have been half the length.
Yeah.
Like, it would have been so easy. But I mean, that is obviously part of his character, which is why we do read it as well, because he does get into these sticky situations, which make it more interesting. But yeah, it's a difference of understanding from generations, shall we say?
Right. Okay. Yeah. So his manliness and his coming to terms with his past and all of the crying that ensues and his journey home, clearly a very big topic of exploration. Yes. And I think, therefore, if we were to break that into its constituent parts, we have to be able to define home as well. And I think Homer sets us up very early in the text with this idea that as much as Odysseus seems to be in quite a lovely place, like where he is stranded isn't somewhere that is in the depth of a horrible jungle where he's in danger 24/7. It's actually pretty good living out there, but he still yearns while he's crying on the beach for home. And you were talking to me a little off camera before we started this about how he gets home, but then you can sort of ask the question of, well, when does he get home? Does he get home when he lands on Ithaca and he touches the sand, so to speak? Is he home at that point? Well, there's probably an argument to be made he's not home yet, because he's not at his house, and he's not with his wife, and he's not with his son. And so you go through these gradual homecomings almost multiple times, and it builds and builds and builds, and you kind of have a gradient to that instead of it being a singular, he's home now, the end. I think that there's probably stuff that I haven't read yet in the text which will feed into that theme and my analysis of it more. Is that something you think the audience should pay sort of special attention to as they get towards the end of the text there, this sort of underlying thing?
Just generally speaking, I think homecoming
through the whole thing.
Yeah, homecoming is the most important theme of the Odyssey.
Oh, wow.
Absolutely.
Okay. Oh.
So the story is mostly referred to as a Nostos. So this is an ancient Greek word, Nostos. And that just means homecoming. So it's not really referred to as being a journey, because it's not Odysseus going from A to B and then back to A.
Sure.
Like, we don't see any of that. It is just B to A. Right. So it's just the return from this big war. And so everything is kind of gearing him up for, again, we open with the question of what is he returning to?
Yeah.
With Orestes. We don't know. The gods, okay, again, everybody kind of knows, but we're supposed to kind of be like, it could go tits up randomly. If Penelope suddenly decides that she just wants to go rogue, it would be completely out of character, but still, there is that question. And constantly, yes, especially when Odysseus makes it home, well, when is he home?
Yeah.
And when he first arrives on the island, it's actually really bizarre. He's just kind of like left there. And then he wakes up and he's like, oh, I'm on Ithaca. And there's no celebration, really. You know, he just acknowledges that he's there. And then he first of all goes to the swineherd. Again, I'm not going to ruin everything for you guys, but still, like, he goes to the swineherd first. And he does this in stages. And so there is that question you're supposed to be asking. It's not necessarily answered, but it is a question that is interestingly posed of, when are you home?
Right.
What, is it when you reunite with your son? Is it when you restore home to what it used to be? You know, in a very extraneous circumstance, like let's say that there was a really bad storm where you were and you had to evacuate, and then you come home and your house doesn't have part of the roof or something.
Sure.
Are you home if the roof isn't fixed? Or is it when you fix the roof and you finally home?
So it's the home of Theseus.
Yeah, you know, it's sort of this big thing.
If you rebuild it, is it still the same thing?
Yeah.
That question,
It's sort of that question that you are supposed to be, I guess, flirting with, like, throughout the text of, when does that happen?
And I suppose then there's an inverted question that you could maybe explore or look out for of not only when does the man get home, but is it the same man?
Yeah.
If he's gone through all this stuff and he's been away for decades, that's a pretty long time. you could question if it's even his home anymore.
Yeah.
But then specifically with him, he is so changed, surely, by the life that he's lived away. And I think he kind of has to rationalize that in himself as well, which for a man who's very arrogant may not be the easiest thing to necessarily do as you sort of go through. I haven't read the full text, so I don't know how he deals with it, but I look forward to finding out.
Don't Google it.
One thing I do know is that he lies all the time.
Yes.
And he does so in a way that's quite interesting, because Homer makes it pretty apparent when he's lying. But there are certain instances where we don't have any external way of knowing whether or not a certain phrase or paragraph or speech, monologue or what have you from Odysseus is a lie or not. Because he tells stories in the text. And when he's telling a story, it's not like there's someone else across the room from him being like, oh, I was there, and that's a load of like, you made it up. That doesn't happen. And
conveniently, all of his men are dead. Like, ooh.
And it's never his fault.
Interesting.
And so what I have consumed of the text so far is a lot of instances of what could be interpreted as Odysseus shirking responsibility for things that he has had a hand in that have played out badly. And I think the question of whether he is consistently an unreliable narrator or not is one that you've dug into on your channel a little bit as well, right?
Yeah, it's something for the readers to kind of take whatever they want to from the text. And I'm always encouraging people to read everything how they want to read things, or to find lessons in whatever it is. But for sure, Odysseus lies. This is not something I think a lot of people will hear that and they'll be like, oh, this is just a modern way of interpreting this, or absolutely not. Like, this is how the ancients would have spoken about it. This is a central part to the story, is that Odysseus takes on many disguises, and he does so because of this Orestes story, right? He does so because there are dangers around every corner. Like, the ancient world is fun for us to read in mythology, but it's also a dangerous place. And so he's not always telling people he's Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, blah, blah. Imagine if the king of some place just showed up. Like, he is opening himself up to very dangerous, potentially dangerous.
And he's very vulnerable. He's showing up naked a lot of the time.
Yes, butt naked, like covering himself with a branch, kind of a thing. So he's not gonna. We're supposed to be behind him in those senses. Like, that's not. We're not supposed to be reading those going, why is he lying? We probably should in that scenario if you're a king. But that is a central part of the story when we have it told in a present flashback present, because we see him lie. And then when he's asked, because that's the central part of the book, he is asked, how did you make it onto our shores? We are curious, because he does tell them, I am actually Odysseus, blah, blah, all of this. And they're like, okay, well, prove it, essentially. And then he tells us the story from Troy to there. And it is conveniently mythical.
Yes.
There are lots of witches and things like that pop up, and like crazy scenarios where it's like, oh, unfortunately, all of my men ate the cattle of the sun, and so therefore they died. Like, all of these bizarre things where he's like, now I'm alone. You are supposed to be sitting there questioning that. Like, the idea was potentially the idea was when a listener is hearing this from a bard, they are suddenly in the seat of the Phaeacians, right? They are making the decision too. Like, Odysseus gets to the end. Are you going to give him a boat? Yeah,
so they're for context, the Phaeacians being the people who Odysseus is telling this seemingly tall tale to. And
it's like a room full of people. Like, everybody wants to hear. This is also part of being a good guest.
Right.
If you are a good guest, a host will say, hey, who are you? Tell us some stories. We got some time this evening. And so as a guest, you are supposed to entertain with those stories. We see this a lot throughout mythology.
Yeah.
And so Odysseus doing this as him being a good guest, 10 out of 10 for him. But again, is he really sailing past the sirens, which are these crazy mythological monsters that sing and that lure men off of boats? Like, well, none of us were there.
Yeah.
It's a good story. I kind of want to believe it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And so that is something which I think is also really interesting just as we read to evaluate his speech by, and to kind of question, okay, if he was lying, why might he be lying here versus in another instance, like why is he open with someone? Why does he reveal himself when he does in the instances when he does? I think that there's a lot of value that can be derived from being aware of all of those moments.
Yeah, I think that's a fun part for the reader as well.
Yeah.
You know, like there doesn't seem to be any conclusion that's drawn from Homer. It's just, I'm telling you the story.
Yeah.
So you get to interpret it. Like, you have fun with it. And that's something that, like, especially when I go into schools and things like that, I'm always like, what do you think? And people love answering that question. So
Right.
absolutely be thinking of that. And there's no right or wrong. Like I always say to people, on first reading, go for it. Like, just have fun with it, interpret it however you need to and however you want to.
Yeah.
Let us know in the comments, obviously.
Classic. Now, that very, very nearly brings us to the end of the iceberg. For me, the final thing on the iceberg is more of a personal bias, and it's that I, in reading this text, don't know what to expect, and I am reading it with modern eyes, right? I've read a lot of modern literature, and I'm now going back to something so old and sort of trying to interpret it through the vehicle of Milo, right? And what that means is that I'm going to be doing that, looking for all of these potential themes and symbols and bits and pieces at the bottom of the iceberg. But you might do the same thing for yourself, you listening to this back home, and have completely different themes that you're interested in, completely different images that are created in your mind, and completely different conclusions. And I think what I'm excited about in going through this process of the ensuing episodes of whether it's with a guest or whether it's just me chopping up and analyzing the text is figuring out what's speaking to me and what's speaking to you and what that discourse can bring us as we explore it. Because even from the conversations that I've had with Erica about this, I mean, you're a fountain of knowledge of all of this stuff. You really are. And it's so interesting hearing about all of these things that I had no idea about. And with every little tidbit I hear from someone else, it informs my evaluation of what I've read. And then I think, oh, maybe I need to dig into a little bit more of this. Something I'm currently really interested in is the agency of the characters, and when a character that is a human is making a decision versus when a god is making a decision for them. That's something I'm looking for. But you might decide not to look for that, and you might look for other things, and that's going to be a collaborative process as we do this. So I encourage you to look for the weird paraphernalia at the bottom of your iceberg, define that, and then bring it to the conversation, because there is so much variability there, and it will lead to some really fun conversations.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The only thing I'd say, just so that everybody can like bear this in mind.
Yes.
And this is probably the best piece of advice. So when I interview experts on my channel, because my episodes are very long, I'll get to the end and I'll say, okay, well, you know, if people have stuck around for this long, can you give them a piece of advice?
Yeah, okay, please.
And I interviewed this incredible scholar. His name is James Rom. He doesn't work with this stuff, but he's an incredible scholar.
Sure.
And I asked him for a piece of advice, and I think he just worded this perfectly, where he paused and he said, don't quit after episode 1.
Oh.
And he went on to elaborate and say, when you watch Game of Thrones, the first episode is, we're just going to use it as an example.
Yeah.
You know, he said it's so jarring. It's a different world. It has different rules. It has different players. It has a different societal structure. And he says that's the exact same thing with the ancient world. That it's not a fantasy world. It is a very real world. But there are lots of different elements that we've been discussing throughout this episode that are just different. And you just have to learn the rules of how this thing works. And the second that all slots in, so speaking of the gods and speaking of characters and their kind of relationship and all of that, you know, you get to understand this throughout the text. Like, it's actually fairly simple, but it's really jarring at first because we're not used to it. And
information overload.
Yes, and we are coming into this with our modern ideas, especially our modern ideas of religion, for example, and those sorts of things. But if you just keep going, it's actually like, oh, okay, a god can do that, or like the god will come down in this form and talk to this character, and like that's pretty regular in this text. Okay, cool. And to just stick with it, because it sounds really confusing on the surface, but as you keep going, it's, you know, by the end of it, you'll have like family trees and you'll be able to explain everybody and it'll be easy.
Fantastic. I think that is a really wonderful message to send us off on for this process, because we're at the beginning right now, and if you want to come on this journey with us, which I would love to have you on board for, there's gonna be some times where you're like, what the hell's going on here? This is a bit weird. Or why is Nesta still talking?
Oh my god, okay. Poor Nesta. Because I make that joke too, all the time.
In those moments, let's persevere together. We're all on the same ship here. We're going in the same direction. And through community, we can beat Nesta's ramblings. So thank you, Erica, so much for the vast knowledge that you've been able to share today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. I'm so excited to see everybody's own individual journey for this. Keep us posted in the comments if there's any changes you'd like made to any of the format or what have you.
I will be stalking the comments, by the way. I'm curious to see if people pick a different version of the book.
Yep, that I'm very curious about.
I'm just so nosy to see everybody's opinions, because it's like so exciting for me. Like, my goal is to make everybody nerds. So to see that there are a bunch of people embarking on this with you, I'm going to be scrolling through like, who are you? Where have you come from? Like, why are you picking this thing?
Hell yeah. And you have, first of all, Erica will be linked in the description of the video, etc. Of course, show notes et al. But you also have a book that, for the purpose of this podcast, let's talk about in the infinitive. It is a book that is already out, essentially, because I don't know exactly when this is going to be released, this episode. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, the book is actually probably perfect for a number of you guys who are watching this, because it is designed to be for people that know nothing. So it's supposed to be very introductory. It is called The Odyssey Effect: How Homer's Epic Poem Shaped the World. So my job that I was given was to basically track the Odyssey from its inception through history to see how it changed, how it adapted, the differences in it maybe, but also the similarities. So when it comes to looking at retellings, I did a lot of looking at those. There are lots of similarities through the ages of like scenes that stay the same. But it is illustrated. It's a really cute little book. It's supposed to be just a small sort of coffee table book. So if you are dipping your toes into this for the first time, and you're more so curious about like, well, how did we go from this to, this summer, which it's not out yet, but the Christopher Nolan film is coming out. If you guys are curious about that journey, that's sort of, I kind of filled in a number of those blanks.
Yeah, I think the reason I wanted to make sure that we talked about this here is there's a huge amount of stuff that we've kind of touched on in this conversation that sadly, just due to the nature of needing to actually get into the book, we're going to kind of move past now. So a lot of the who was Homer and what was going on at the time and how did the text survive and in what forms did it survive and how has translation affected it in this, that, and the other scenarios. These are things that I'm not going to spend a huge amount more time exploring through this series, but the journey the Odyssey has taken is something that you explore in the book to great length, and so I really do recommend taking a look for that if you're interested in that.
Milo's seen it.
I have seen it. I've held it in my hands. It's lovely. The illustrations are lovely. I can personally vouch for this one. So definitely to give that a look, and I'll pop that in the video description as well.
Thank you.
Of course. So thank you, Erica, once again. And
again, thank you to you guys for watching.
Yeah, I will be back with the next special guest episode very soon, and we'll have the interim episodes going out nice and shortly as well. Thanks, folks.